Picture a room full of military experts sitting around a polished table in Washington, D.C. They have degrees on walls, medals on their chests, and charts spread out in front of them. They study the numbers, read the reports, and make their decision. This weapon is finished. It is too weak. It is too small. It belongs in a museum, not on a battlefield. They sign the paperwork, close the folders, and move on to bigger, more impressive things. They are completely confident they are right. And on the night of October 24th, 1942, somewhere in the dripping darkness of a jungle ridge on Guadalcanal, those experts were about to be proven spectacularly, violently, and permanently wrong. The weapon they had written off was called the 37mm M-2 On paper, it sounded serious. In person, it looked almost comical. The barrel was thin, barely thicker than a lead pipe. The wheels were small and narrow, the kind of wheels you might expect to find on a vegetable cart at farmer's market, not on a weapon of war. The whole thing sat so low to the ground that a tall man would have to crouch just to look through the sight properly. It weighed 900 pounds, which sounds heavy until you realize that some of the other guns on the battlefield weighed 10 times that amount. The M3 was, in the eyes of nearly everyone who carried a rifle or a rank, a bad joke. The soldiers called it the Pea Shooter. They called it the door knocker. Those nicknames were not affectionate. They were mockery. They were the kind of nicknames you give something when you want everyone to know you have zero respect for it. Men made bets about whether the gun could punch through a sheet of plywood. They laughed when the gun crews walked by. They shook their heads and wondered why anyone was wasting precious ship space hauling this little toy across the Pacific Ocean. The mockery had a real reason behind it. The 37mm gun had already been tested in actual combat, and it had failed badly. In the deserts of North Africa and across the flat fields of Europe, American crews had fired this gun at German tanks and watched the shells bounce right off. The German armor was thick and solid, and it simply did not care about the 37mm round. The shell would smack the side of a Panzer, spark once, and spin away into the sky. The tank crew inside barely felt it. They might have knocked over a coffee cup. That was about the extent of the damage. Reports flooded back to Washington, describing the gun as completely useless against enemy armor. The military's top brass agreed. The gun was already being phased out. Bigger, heavier, more powerful cannons were being built to replace it. The 37mm M3 was a relic before the war was even halfway over. But the Marine Corps does not throw things away easily. When the 1st Marine Division was loading its ships for the invasion of the Solomon Islands, they took everything they could find. Rifles, mortars, machine guns, medical supplies, and yes, several 37mm M3 guns packed into wooden crates and loaded onto the transport ships like unwanted furniture being moved to a storage unit. The men who would crew those guns knew exactly what their fellow Marines thought of the weapons. They felt it in every smirk, every sideways glance, every comment tossed their way on beach as they dragged those 900-pound guns to the wet sand. It was not a prestigious assignment. It felt like being handed a stick and told to fight a tiger. Then Guadalcanal itself made everything worse. The island was not just a battlefield. It was a living nightmare. The heat was thick and heavy, like breathing through a wet towel. The mud was bottomless, sucking at boots and wheels with a grip that refused to let go. The jungle was so dense and so tangled that soldiers sometimes had to turn sideways just to squeeze between the trees. Moving a man through that jungle was hard. Moving a 900-pound gun through it was pure torture. The gun crews strapped harnesses around their chests and pulled like oxen, dragging the M3S through swamps, up muddy slopes, and through vegetation so thick that visibility sometimes dropped to less than 20 feet. And every step of the way, the infantry watched and offered their helpful opinions. Why are you bringing that thing up here? There are no tanks in this jungle. Why don't you leave that dead weight on the beach? Why don't you just go home and let the real weapons handle this? The criticism was not entirely unfair. Guadalcanal was exactly the wrong kind of terrain for an anti-tank gun. The Japanese armor was bogged down on the other side of the river, stuck in the same mud that was making everyone miserable. There were no clear sight lines to fire down. The trees and vines blocked every angle. This was close-quarters country. This was a kind of fighting where a man and his rifle and his knife were more useful than any piece of machinery. The 37mm gun was, By every logical measure, the wrong weapon in the wrong place at the wrong time. But here is what the experts back in Washington had never considered. Here is what the mocking infantrymen had never thought about. The Japanese were not going to attack like European armies attacked. There were no tank columns rolling across open fields. There were no structured artillery duels from a safe distance. The Japanese strategy was something far more terrifying. It was the Banzai charge. When a moment came, thousands of Japanese soldiers would fix their bayonets, scream at the top of their lungs, and sprint directly into the American lines. They would run through machine gun fire. They would climb over their own dead. They would keep moving forward through anything, absorbing bullets, absorbing casualties, and rely on the sheer unstoppable weight of thousands of human bodies to smash through whatever was in front of them. It was a strategy designed to overwhelm, to terrify, to drown the enemy in a flood of men. Against a flood of men, you do not need precision. You do not need armor penetration numbers. You do not need a gun that can punch a hole in hardened steel from half a mile away. You need something that can clear an entire section of jungle in a single heartbeat. You need something that can turn a charging formation into chaos in the time it takes to blink. The gun crews looked at their despised little cannon and started asking a different question. Not what can this gun do to a tank, but what can this gun do to 100 men running straight at us? The answer was sitting in a wooden crate at the back of the ammunition dump, partially buried under stacks of standard tank-killing rounds that were completely useless in the jungle. The supply crate was labeled canister M2. The logistics officers had cataloged it as a routine item. The manual described it as a round used for clearing brush and barbed wire. Nobody had paid it much attention. But the gun crews pried the lid off with bayonets and understood immediately what they were looking at. The canister round did not look like a weapon designed to kill men. It looked blunt and ugly, almost industrial, like the end cap on a piece of sewer pipe. But the physics inside that blunt, ugly casing were devastating. Think of a standard shotgun shell. Inside that plastic tube are dozens of small lead pellets. When the gun fires, those pellets spray outward in a spreading cone, covering a wide area with deadly force at close range. Now take that same principle and scale it up dramatically. The M2 canister shell was packed with 122 steel balls, each ball nearly half an inch thick. The outer casing was thin metal designed to disintegrate the moment it left the barrel. When the gun fired, those 122 steel balls exploded outward in a fan-shaped cone that grew wider with every yard it traveled. At 100 yards, that cone covered an entire jungle trail. At 200 yards, it was a moving wall of steel that nothing could survive. There was no explosive charge inside, no fancy fuse, no timing mechanism. It was just raw, simple, unstoppable physics. It was a weapon built to sweep a battlefield the way a broom sweeps a floor, clean, fast, and absolute. But using it to its full potential required one more decision, and that decision meant choosing between safety and speed. The M3 gun came from the factory with a thick steel shield bolted to the front. The shield was designed to protect the crew from bullets and shrapnel. It was heavy, reassuring, a solid wall of metal standing between the gunners and everything trying to kill them. But that shield also limited what the crew could see. Looking through it was like looking through a mail slot. You could see what was directly in front of the gun, but you were completely blind to the sides. In an open field, fighting tanks at long range, that was fine. In a jungle, with the enemy coming from multiple directions at once, it was a death sentence. The gun sergeant made the call. He ordered the men to remove the shields entirely. They used wrenches and worked fast, unbolting the heavy steel plates and letting them drop into the mud. The guns looked naked without them. The crews were now completely exposed, standing in the open with nothing between their bodies and enemy fire. They had traded their protection for mobility. Without the weight of the shield, the gun balanced perfectly on its axle, and a single man could grab the trail and swing the entire barrel left or right as fast as he could move his own body. They had turned an artillery piece into something that moved like a pistol. They stacked the canister rounds in the mud beside the wheels, cleaned the breech blocks, checked the springs, and settled in to wait. The night of October 24th closed in like a fist. The rain was relentless, The kind of tropical downpour that turns a world into a gray curtain where nothing is visible past 10 feet. The Marines on the ridge were not in good shape. Weeks of fighting had hollowed them out. Malaria had hit many of them. Dysentery was taking others. They were hungry, surviving on whatever they could find, and their uniforms were so rotted by the heat and moisture that the cloth was literally falling apart on their bodies. They were exhausted in a way that sleep cannot fix, the kind of exhaustion that settles into the bones. On the other side of the wire, the Sendai Division was fresh. They had landed recently with new supplies, new weapons, and new men who had studied the American positions carefully. Their commander, General Maruyama, had written that night's date in his diary with complete confidence. This was the night the airfield fell. This was the night the American line broke. He had looked at the intelligence reports about the small guns the Marines had dragged up the ridge and dismissed them entirely. His officers had laughed. They told him those were training weapons. They told him the guns would be overrun in the first 30 seconds of the charge. No one on the Japanese side was worried about the Pea Shooters. The silence that fell over the jungle a few minutes before the attack was the most frightening sound any of the Marines would ever hear. The insects stopped. The birds went quiet. Every man on the line knew what that silence meant. The jungle holds its breath before something terrible happens. The gun crews gripped the cold metal of the trails. They checked the stacked canister rounds one more time. They breathed slowly and waited. The first contact came just before 11 o'clock. It was not the main assault. It was a testing probe, a small group of Japanese soldiers moving silently up the slope to locate the American machine guns and draw their fire. When a Marine gun on the left flank spotted the movement and squeezed his trigger, the ridge exploded into a chaotic exchange of light. Japanese rifles cracked from the tree line. A light machine gun opened up from behind a stump. Tracers zipped back and forth across the rain-soaked ground. And then a group of Japanese soldiers broke from cover and sprinted toward a gap between two machine gun positions, a blind spot the automatic weapons could not cover. They had found it. They were exploiting it. They were 30 yards from the break in the line, screaming, bayonets out, moving fast across the slick ground. The gunner on the number 137 millimeters did not reach for a scope. He did not consult a range table. He looked over the open barrel, grabbed the traverse bar, and swung the naked gun toward the running shapes. He shouted a command. The loader drove a canister round into the breach with both hands. The block slammed shut with sound like a vault door closing. The gunner stomped on the firing pedal. The gun spoke, and it did not speak quietly. The blast shook water off the nearby leaves. A 3-foot tongue of fire erupted from the muzzle, and then the 122 steel balls went to work. The group of Japanese soldiers simply ceased to exist as a fighting unit. One moment they were sprinting men. The next moment, the space they had occupied was a mess of shredded vegetation and mist. The grass was cut to the soil. The vines were gone. The screaming stopped instantly, replaced by the echoing ring of the gun and the bright clang of the empty brass casing bouncing off the wheel. The nearby Marines who had spent weeks mocking the Pea Shooter stared into the dark. A machine gun kills one man at a time, stitching a line of holes across a target. This was something entirely different. This was erasure. The gun had simply deleted a piece of the battlefield, and nobody was laughing anymore. The gun crew did not look up for applause. They were already reloading. The probe had told the Japanese everything they needed to know. They knew where the guns were. They knew the Americans had brought something dangerous. General Maruyama did not pause. He did not reconsider. He ordered the main attack to begin. He also ordered his heavy weapons to concentrate on the muzzle flashes of the 37 millimeters guns. He understood that the guns were the spine of the defense. Break the spine, and the whole body collapses. 20 minutes later, a horn sounded from deep in the jungle. It was a long, low, haunting note that cut straight through the noise of the rain. Then came the voices. First a murmur, then a roar. Thousands of men screaming a single word in unison. The ground actually vibrated beneath the Marines' boots. Officers with swords emerged from the tree line first, waving their men forward. Flags moved through the rain. And behind them came the wave, a solid mass of men in brown uniforms running straight into the American fire, not caring about the machine guns, not stopping for dead, just coming and coming and coming. The Marine machine guns opened up. Red tracers poured down the slope. Japanese soldiers fell in rows. More replaced them instantly, stepping over the bodies without breaking stride. They were getting closer. 100 yards. 80 yards. The 37mm guns opened fire together. The sound was unlike anything else on the ridge. Boom. The metallic clack of the empty case ejecting. Another round shoved home. Boom again. The crews fell into a rhythm that was almost mechanical. Load, fire, eject, load, fire, eject. Each shot sent a fan of steel balls ripping through the charging formation. It looked like watching someone drag a giant invisible hand through a wheat field. Wherever the guns pointed, the charge collapsed. Men were thrown backward. Entire sections of the formation simply fell down and did not get up. But for every 10 men who went down, 20 more appeared from the darkness. The Japanese were too many. They knew it. They surged harder, focusing their fire on the exposed gun crews. Bullets struck the wheels and the barrels. A loader took a round in the shoulder and dropped. Another man dove from a nearby position to take his place, sliding on the thick carpet of hot brass casings that were already piling up around the gun. The choice to strip the shields was now bleeding the crews. Shrapnel from grenades that landed close was finding unprotected skin. Men were cut and bleeding, but stopping was not an option. Stopping meant the line broke. Stopping meant everyone died. The barrel of the number 1 gun began to glow. The paint on the steel bubbled and burned off. The recoil mechanism was working so hard that every shot drove the wheels deeper into the mud. The gunner could no longer hear orders through the ringing in his ears. He watched the tracers and the shapes in the darkness and kept firing. When a Japanese officer with a sword tried to lead a flanking group around the right side of the position, the gunner leaned his shoulder into the traverse bar, swung the smoking barrel right, and stomped the pedal without waiting. The officer and his men vanished in a spray of mud and shredded vegetation. The stacks of canister rounds beside the wheels were shrinking fast. The pile of empty brass was growing into a shining mound that the crew slipped on as they moved. The gun sergeant looked at the crates and saw the bottom approaching. They were burning through ammunition at a rate that could not last. The Japanese were still coming. The horn was still blowing. The tide was rising, and the guns were beginning to crack under the strain. By 2 a.m, the battle had stopped following any kind of organized plan. The careful defensive lines that existed on maps a few hours earlier were now just ideas. The Japanese Sendai Division had pushed so close that the smell of blood and burning gunpowder was overwhelming. The ridge, invisible in darkness a few hours ago, was now a flickering, strobing madhouse of muzzle flashes and signal flares. The 37mm crews were operating far beyond any limits described in their training manuals. The manual said 25 rounds per minute was a maximum rate of fire. The crews were firing 30, maybe 35. They were loading so fast that the recoil systems could not reset between shots. The guns were physically bouncing off the ground with every blast. When the mud-soaked wheels slammed back down and the rain water touched the glowing barrels, the water turned to steam before it even had time to run, wrapping the crews in a fog that smelled like hot oil and scorched metal. The recoil cylinders were overheating, making the guns kick violently with every shot. The gunners had stopped aiming at individual soldiers. There was no point. The target was the darkness itself. They were firing into the mass of bodies pouring from the jungle and trusting the physics of the canister round to handle the rest. At 50 yards, the canister shot was not just killing men. It was tearing through everything in front of the muzzle. Vines, tree trunks, tall grass, everything was shredded. The jungle in front of the gun positions was being physically dismantled, branch by branch, stalk by stalk, until there was nothing left but open ground and the wreckage of the Sendai Division's finest troops. But the guns were burning themselves out from the inside. The steel barrels had turned a dull cherry red. Touching the breech block with a bare hand would have seared the skin to the bone. The gun grease had cooked away hours ago, leaving dry metal grinding against dry metal. The crews kicked the breech handles open with their boots because their hands, even through gloves, could not bear the heat. They were pouring water from their canteens over the barrels, watching it evaporate instantly before it could do any good. They were destroying the guns to keep them firing, and they all knew it, and not one of them stopped. Then the gap opened. A squad of Japanese grenadiers had crawled through a drainage ditch on the left side of the line, moving low under the machine gun fire, invisible in the dark and the rain. They came up 20 yards from the No. 2 gun. The crew never saw them. 3 grenades landed in the mud around the wheels. The explosions came fast and close. When the smoke and dirt settled, the No. 2 gun was pointing uselessly at the sky. One wheel shattered, the crew gone. The Japanese heard the silence where that gun had been and surged toward it immediately. They were screaming. They were inside the perimeter. This was the moment battles are lost. This is when trained soldiers look at what is coming and decide it is no longer survivable. This is when the line breaks and the retreat starts and everything falls apart. Sergeant Mitchell Page did not retreat. He watched the second gun go silent from across the position. Something inside him stopped calculating and started moving. He grabbed his machine gun, the heavy, 30-pound weapon that was his personal tool, and he ran, not away from the gap, directly into it. He sprinted to the mud in the dark, jumping over bodies, ducking under bullets, heading for the hole in the line where his men had died. He reached the shattered position, understood immediately that the 37mm gun was beyond saving, and set up his machine gun on the edge of the foxhole instead. He was alone. No loader, no spotter, no backup within reach. The Japanese were 10 yards away and climbing over the sandbags. Page opened fire. He swung the gun left and right, screaming into the dark, sweeping the area with fire, holding the gap with one man and one weapon while the rest of the line tried to reorganize. He was not being heroic in the way the movies show. He was not standing tall with a flag behind him. He was soaked and bleeding and half-deaf, running on nothing but the refusal to let this position fall. He bought time. He plugged the gap with his own body. Back at the last functioning 37mm gun, the crew scraped the bottom of the ammunition crates with growing desperation. The loaders were pulling rounds that were caked in mud, wiping them on their shirts, shoving them into the breech. The gun was dangerously hot. There was a real risk that a round sitting in the chamber for more than a second or two might cook off on its own from the heat alone. The gunners had to time every shot with sharp precision. Load. Fire instantly. Do not wait. The Japanese had figured out that this gun was the anchor of the entire defense, and they shifted their mortars onto it. The explosions walked toward the position. Thump and crash, each one a little closer. Dirt and shrapnel rained over the exposed crew. A mortar landed 5 yards in front of the wheels. The concussion lifted the 900-pound gun off the ground. The gun was thrown backward, blood running from both ears. He got up, crawled back to his seat, put his eyes on the target, and stomped the pedal. He did not check himself for wounds. The gun was still working. That was all that mattered. And in the moment, every gun crew dreads more than any enemy charge. The loader reached into the crate and felt nothing but wood. He checked the next crate. Empty. He looked at the ground around him, at the thousands of spent brass casings gleaming in the flare light like scattered coins. There were no live rounds. The Pea Shooter had fired everything it had. The gun went silent. The Japanese heard it the same way a predator hears a heartbeat stop. They surged. A wave of men rose from the grass and came over the ridge, screaming, moving fast, knowing the gun was dead and the position was open. Sergeant Page saw the gun go quiet. He did not order a retreat. He did not accept that it was over. He screamed at his men to search everything. Check the other positions. Check the bodies. Check the mud. Find ammunition. Find anything. A runner came sprinting back from the rear supply dump, sliding to the mud on his knees, carrying a single crate. The crew tore it open and saw solid steel slugs inside, armor-piercing rounds built to punch through tank armor. Against charging infantry, a solid slug was nearly useless. It would hit one man, pass straight through him, and bury itself in the dirt 10 feet behind him. It would not stop the charge. Page ordered them to load it anyway. The loader shoved a round home. The Japanese were 30 yards out. Their faces were visible now, mouths open, eyes bright, bayonets catching the flare light. The gunner traversed the barrel. He did not aim at the men. He aimed at the volcanic rock and hard soil directly in front of their feet. He fired. The solid steel slug hit the rock at 2,000 feet per second and shattered it. The impact turned the ground itself into a grenade, sending sharp stone fragments spraying upward like shrapnel. The front row of the Japanese charge went down screaming, cut by pieces of the very island they were trying to take. It was not clean. It was not elegant. It was improvised desperation, something borrowed from a pool hall and applied to a battlefield. But it worked. The gunner yelled to bank every remaining shot off the hard ground in front of the enemy. The crew fired the solid slugs into the rock and dirt, creating small localized explosions of stone and debris, keeping the enemy pinned, keeping heads down, buying seconds that nobody had any right to expect. The sky to the east began to show the faintest trace of gray. Dawn was coming. General Murayama understood what that meant. Once the sun came up, the American aircraft on the airfield below would be in the sky. His men in the open would be strafed and bombed in the daylight. He had to finish this in the dark. He committed his last reserve. Fresh troops who marched uphill over the bodies of the men who had gone before them. They came in a solid line, ignoring everything, marching for the gun. The gun crew fired their last armor-piercing round. The breech opened. Empty. Truly empty. 20 feet away, the Japanese were still coming. The gunner stood up from his seat. He grabbed the ramrod, a heavy steel cleaning pole. The loader picked up a shovel. They stood in front of their silent cannon and decided that nobody was going to touch it. Then the jungle behind them erupted. The Marine Reserve Company, which had been fighting its way up the ridge for the past hour, broke through at the worst and best possible moment. They hit the Japanese flank with rifles and grenades, and a fury born of exhaustion and rage. The ridge dissolved into the most primal kind of fighting, men swinging rifle butts, wrestling in the mud, using helmets as weapons, fighting with their hands when their ammunition ran out. Page was in the center of it, his machine gun jammed and useless, swinging the hot barrel like a club. The 37mm crews fought with their wrenches and their fists. It was not a military engagement anymore. It was a brawl in the dark among men who had nothing left to lose. And it was enough. The Japanese momentum, which had seemed unstoppable through the entire long night, ran into something it could not absorb. It slowed. It stopped. For the first time in 6 hours, the Sendai Division took a step back. The sun broke over the ridge on the morning of October 25th and showed everyone what the night had cost. As the gray light grew stronger and pushed through the smoke, the Marines stood up slowly, their bodies stiff and trembling, their eyes hollow. They turned and looked out over the ground in front of the gun positions. Nobody spoke for a long moment. The thick jungle that had stood on that ridge the previous morning was simply gone. The trees had been stripped bare. The tall grass was shaved to the mud. The vines and undergrowth had been reduced to splinters in front of the gun muzzles. For 200 yards in every direction, the terrain looked like it had been processed by a machine, and covering that stripped, broken ground were the remains of the Sendai Division, stacked and tangled and piled in ways that no official report would ever fully capture. The final body count exceeded 2,000 Japanese soldiers killed in the area directly in front of the Marine line. The nearest bodies had been found within arm's reach of the 37mm gun wheels. The division that had been called the finest jungle fighting force in the Japanese army, a unit that had never been defeated, had been fed into the canister rounds of the pea shooters all night long and had come out the other side as a broken, shattered remnant. General Vandegrift and the senior Marine officers arrived on the ridge later that morning. These were the same men who had considered leaving the M3 guns on the beach. They walked past the exhausted, hollow-eyed gun crews without saying anything at first. They stopped in front of the number 1 gun and looked at it. The barrel had lost all its paint, burned to a pale, ghostly gray-white by the sustained fire. The recoil springs were fused together from the heat. The tires were flat and torn. The whole gun looked like it had been dragged through a furnace. But around it, covering the ground in every direction, thousands of empty brass casings glittered in the morning sun, a metallic sea that crunched under every boot step. The empty canister crates were stacked 6 feet high, and beyond them, the field of dead stretched into the jungle. The general stood there for a long time. Then he walked away without saying a word about door knockers or pea shooters or waste of shipping space. The jokes were over. The doctrine was wrong. The manual had failed. The experts in the comfortable offices had looked at the mathematics of armor penetration and missed a simple, brutal truth that was now spread across 200 yards of Guadalcanal mud. The gun was never meant to kill tanks. It was meant to kill this. It just needed someone willing to figure that out. Within days of the battle, the 37mm gun went from the most mocked weapon in the division to the most requested. Every infantry commander wanted one on his flank. Supply officers were rated for every crate of canister shot in the Pacific Theater. The gun crews who had been dragging their embarrassing little cannon through swamps while infantry soldiers sneered at them were now being asked for favors. Men offered to dig their foxholes. Men offered to carry their ammunition. Men who had once called the gun a joke were now the loudest voices demanding to have it nearby. The weapon that nearly got left on the beach had become the backbone of the entire Guadalcanal defense. Sergeant Mitchell Page received the Medal of Honor for what he did that night. The official citation described his courage and his leadership and his refusal to abandon his position. All of that was true, but Page himself knew that the story was bigger than one man. It was the loaders who kept shoving rounds into a gun that was literally glowing red. It was the gunners who kept firing after their ears stopped working and their hands started bleeding. It was the anonymous Marine who ran from the rear supply dump in the middle of the firefight, carrying a single crate of ammunition on his back. It was a collective stubbornness of men who had been given a broken, despised, supposedly useless tool and refused to accept that it could not do the job. The 37mm M3 gun did not survive the war with its reputation intact for long. By 1944, the fighting had moved to different islands and different circumstances. Better weapons arrived. The Sherman tank brought its own 75mm gun. The bazooka gave infantry soldiers the ability to kill tanks on their own. The flamethrower became the new answer to the bunkers and fortifications of the later Pacific Campaign. The little M3 was quietly retired, towed to the rear, stripped for parts, abandoned in supply yards, and eventually melted down to make steel for newer, bigger, more technologically impressive weapons. The guns that had broken the finest infantry division in the Japanese army were turned into something else. They had their moment, and the moment passed. Mitchell Page came home after the war to a country that was already looking forward. The atomic bomb had ended everything. Jet engines were changing the world. The gritty, close, brutal fighting of 1942, the foxholes and the canister rounds and the mud-soaked ridges, felt like it had happened in a different century. Page lived a full life, writing and speaking, and wearing his Medal of Honor. He died in 2003. But in every account he ever gave, every speech he ever made, he always came back to that ridge. He always came back to the rain, and the smell of burning powder, and the sound of canister rounds made leaving the barrel. He always came back to the faces of the gun crews, young men from every corner of America, standing behind a weapon that everyone had written off, holding a line that the experts said could not hold. These men do not show up in many books. Their weapon did not make the cover of any magazine. Nobody made a movie about the Pea Shooter. History tends to remember the dramatic and the massive, the atomic bomb, the aircraft carriers, the fighter planes with the names painted on their noses. The 37mm M3 anti-tank gun does not fit that image. It was small and ugly and cheap, and everyone hated it. But on one specific night, on one specific muddy ridge in the Solomon Islands, it was the most important piece of machinery on Earth. It stood between a fresh, battle-hardened Japanese division and the airfield that controlled the entire Southern Pacific. And it held. If you visit a military museum today and you happen to walk past a 37mm M3, you might not even stop. It looks too small to take seriously. The barrel is thin. The wheels look like they came off a bicycle. Most visitors drift toward the big tanks and the massive artillery pieces, the weapons that looked the part. But now you know the truth about that little gun in the corner. You know what it did when no one believed it could do anything. You know that it earned its place in history not by working the way it was designed, but by being pointed in the right direction by the right men at the right moment. Remember that the next time an expert tells you something is useless. Remember that the next time someone says a plan is wrong, the tool is outdated, or you do not have what you need to succeed. Remember the Pea Shooter. Remember the men who dragged it through the mud when everyone laughed. Remember that the thing everyone dismissed without a second thought was the thing that saved everything. The experts were wrong about the math. The Marines were right about the mud. And sometimes that is all the difference in the world. If you believe these men and this story deserve to be remembered, hit the like button. It helps bring more forgotten moments like this one into the light. Subscribe so you never miss another deep dive into the battles and weapons and people that history almost lost. And drop a comment below, because we want to know, what is another weapon or invention that everyone wrote off that ended up changing everything? We read every single one. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping the memory of the men who stood behind the Pea Shooter alive. They held the line for us. The very least we can do is remember them.